Hello.
Before I start, I want to say that when I say on the radio that I have a face for radio, now you know it's true. I have a face for radio. And I do want to do a shout out for someone who can't possibly be here because he passed away. He used to live on Cortelliu Road. And it was through him that I became active in environmental issues and energy issues in particular. His name was Jacob Aftel. And I tried a lot of groups, not liking them. I found an awful lot of them. And I clicked with Jacob and became active and then more active. And we became sort of the really nice introvert-extrovert team, where people who were not comfortable with an extrovert, there he was, and people were like, he doesn't say anything. You know, there I was. I was the technical guy, and he was sort of the people person. It was a nice combination. And he passed away of cancer 21 years ago, and I never forget him, and so I want to always mention him now when I'm talking about Indian Point, because without him I would not have been as active as I am now. I'm the author of Chernobyl on the Hudson. I was active right around 3 Mile Island, and there was a lot of activity going on during that. And then in '82, there were 1.2 million people marched and rallied for nuclear disarmament. And the nuclear power movement kind of dissolved away. I kept researching nuclear power issues and things, and then when Chernobyl happened in '86, the New York Greens, fledgling organization that some of you may know, published Chernobyl on the Hudson. I went to a meeting and I brought out this continuous forms. They were like this long. And I was saying, I need help in choosing what to put on a flyer. And they said, no, we're not putting out a flyer, we're putting out a booklet. And that's how Chernobyl on the Hudson was born. And it's on my website, so you can read the whole thing. It was designed by Mercy Van Black, my better half, sitting in the back, so that you can sort of start reading it anywhere in the middle. And it works. Nuclear power plants, all they do is boil water. That's it. They boil water. Coal plants, that's what they do. They boil water. Natural gas plants, they boil water. That's all they do. They boil water. The boiling water turns a turbine, and the water circulates. In the case of hydroelectric, the water goes directly. You don't have to burn anything. And this water is boiling at several thousand degrees Fahrenheit. The lowest figure I've seen is 1,500 degrees centigrade, which is almost 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. You have to keep it cool because if it gets too hot, the damn thing starts to melt. And once it gets to a temperature of around 8,000 degrees Fahrenheit, the uranium melts together. There are control rods that come in from the top. They're made of cadmium or boron, and they absorb the neutrons to slow down the reaction of the uranium and the fuel. And when it's melted together, well, how are you going to get those control rods in? So it starts to run away and gets hotter and hotter, and it will melt the reactor vessel, it will melt the floor. That's why they call it a China syndrome. It will melt clear down to China. That's what happened in Fukushima. It happened a little bit at 3 Mile Island, but it happened a lot in Fukushima. That's why it's still hot. It's run away. There's a bit of a blackout about it. It's kind of strange in that where did I write in my notes here? In an interview with Exopolitics TV, independent scientist Lauren Murray points out that scientists working for the US or Japanese government have very different data on radiation exposure than scientists not working for those governments. And she accuses the two governments of a deliberate cover-up. She compares it to the BP disaster cover-up. And Canada has joined in. When the US shut down radiation monitors on the West Coast, so did Canada. Then both countries stated that the radiation levels were safe, despite the fact that they were not monitoring them. How did they know? Ms. Murray also stated that people in Vancouver, Seattle, San Francisco, and Arizona areas reported a salty taste in their mouths when it rained, which is a sign of radioactive cesium salts in the air. She also points out that infant mortality has gone up 35% in Berkeley, Santa Cruz, Spokane, and Seattle. The British Columbia coroner has noted the spike in infant mortality there. Dr. Jeanette Sherman was attacked when she published these facts, but those challenging her discovered a 45% spike in infant mortality in Portland, Seattle, Spokane, and Vancouver. This was due to higher rainfall and higher rainout of radiation in those areas. She also pointed out that Obama took his family to the southern hemisphere for several weeks after the Fukushima accident. Fukushima was 6,000 miles from those cities I just mentioned. So the radiation traveled from Japan 6,000 miles. The evacuation zone around the U.S. nuclear plant is 10 miles. The NRC acts as if the laws of physics stop 10 miles from a nuclear power plant. But I guess we can, to be fair, they don't have a physicist on their staff. So how could they expect to know any physics? They don't have any medical people on their staff either, so how could they expect to know what radiation does to people? They don't know, they don't care, they don't want to know. They work with industry. People who work for the NRC, 1 year are working for a nuclear utility, another year. They get that job because they do, while they're at the NRC, they do things that that nuclear utility likes a whole lot. The NRC is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. That's the agency of the government that is charged with keeping us safe from nuclear power. But they don't. What they do is whenever a nuclear power plant anywhere can't do the health and safety regulations, if they just can't meet the regulations or they don't want to, for any one of a number of reasons, usually money, or sometimes it's money, and sometimes it's money. And whenever they don't want to meet a regulation, the NRC gives them an exemption, so they don't have to. There was a hearing in Westchester on June 2nd of this year. Public hearing, people got a chance to speak. There were so many people there who were voicing opposition to Indian Point and saying shut it down, that the little slideshow they had showing how wonderful Indian Point was and how safe it was and how beneficial it was, every time they lied in that slideshow, people started screaming, "Liar! Liar!" And they kept saying, you know, let us speak, you know, we're not going to let you speak. And people continued to call them liars. They finally shut the hearing down for a couple of minutes. When they came back, they decided not to do their slideshow. No more lies. And they let everybody speak. So the people, Westchester and New York City, there were 2 busloads of New Yorkers went up there, took over an NRC hearing. And unlike most public hearings like this, they actually spoke back to the audience. So people started asking them questions. How many exemptions does Indian Point have? Only 100. I was sitting there going, only 100 exemptions for health and safety. I have a problem with any exemptions at all. I have a problem with being health and safety exemptions. I have the problem with it being 100 health and safety exemptions. I have a problem with the NRC guy calling that only. I'm sorry, 100 health and safety exemptions is not an only. 0 is an only. Maybe even 1 is an only, not 100. And this is what the NRC does to protect us. One woman who lives in Westchester said, it's not an evacuation. It's a permanent relocation. If Indian Point melts down or has a really bad accident, a hydrogen explosion or whatever, you're not moving back to your home. It's going to be radioactive. And nobody's going to buy the damn thing. And all insurance exempts nuclear power plant accidents. All right? I can sit here knowing only a handful of you in this room, and I can tell you, your insurance for your home, for your car, specifically exempts nuclear power plant accidents. You do not get paid. Your insurance will not cover you. That was built for the nuclear industry back in 1957. It's called the Price-Anderson Act. And that exempts them from insurance, because no insurance company is going to want to pay. There's one accident, and you have to pay the value of everybody's home because they can't move back. Any insurance company will go out of business with one nuclear accident. So they won't insure it. So the government does it for us. And part of the deal is that they don't have to pay the full value. So you get a few cents for every $1,000 your home is worth. That's all you get. Because they want to protect this industry. Now we all know that there was an earthquake in Japan that, I'm going to use the word destroyed several nuclear power plants, releasing an amazing amount of radiation, raining death upon the people of Japan, and they did die. The workers who went in to try to keep it from getting worse are about the biggest heroes you can think of, because they died or are dying. The US NRC recommended any American within 50 miles of Fukushima leave. But the evacuation zone for Americans in America is 10 miles. So it's interesting that the NRC was more willing to protect the Americans in Japan than they are the Americans in America. Every day that a nuclear power plant operates, it is putting radiation into the air and water. Every day. They're called routine emissions because they are indeed routine. They have a vent that they just open up and let the gas out, or sometimes they use a fan, that's called purging. Because the uranium, that's the fuel, it's radioactive, so it's giving out radioactive particles, alpha, beta, and gamma. But it's also decaying into other elements. Those elements, of course, we're talking 1,000 degrees, accumulate as a gas in the reactor vessel. If there's too much of that gas, the reactor will shut down. Since they don't want it to shut down, they open a vent and out it goes. And wherever the wind is going is where that goes. And what is it? It's strontium-90, it is cesium-137, it's the iodine-131, it's tritium, which is radioactive hydrogen. Those words may not mean much to you, so I'll tell you what happens to them when they get into your body. They're all heavier than air, so eventually they will cool down, and they won't be gases anymore, and they'll fall wherever they happen to fall. However strong the wind is, that's how far they get carried away. They go into the water, they go into the soil. If it's raining, it goes into the rainwater, it goes wherever the rain goes. About 1/5 of what's in the rainwater is going to end up in cow's milk if a cow is using that water. Cesium-137 will go in your body where sodium and potassium go. They will affect your muscles and reproductive organs. That's where the birth defects come from. Tritium is radioactive hydrogen. That's all over your body. So you'll have radiation anywhere. Strontium-90 is like calcium in the body. When your body takes in strontium-90, it sort of sees that as just like calcium, so it sends it to where the body sends calcium when you eat calcium, so into your bones and teeth. So now that's where the leukemia is going to be coming from, with radioactive strontium. Strontium, for example, is a beta emitter. This is almost thick enough to stop a beta particle. This is thick enough to stop an alpha particle. So an alpha particle on the outside won't get through your skin, but if it's on the inside, it won't get through your skin either. So that alpha particle, that beta particle, is going to stay in your body once it gets there. So whatever element that it's in gets washed out, because your body cycles the calcium in your bones about every 10, 12 years. So eventually, after 10 or 12 years, it'll be gone, doing whatever damage it was doing that entire time. Remember, this is a routine emission. This comes out all the time. And because Connecticut is downwind of Indian Point, the people of Connecticut are constantly saying, we want in on decisions that have to do with Indian Point, because we're getting the radiation. And the NRC repeatedly says, no, you're more than 10 miles away, you don't count. And they're right in the path. When the Alliance to Shut Indian Point used to do balloon releases in the 80s. And they have a little postcard attached to a helium balloon, and they send it up and ask people to send the postcard in so they could see how far these balloons went. Because the Hudson River revival that Friends of Clearwater does every year was not too far from Indian Point. So it's a pretty good indication. And they came from all over Connecticut, a little bit of Westchester and Putnam, a little bit of Western Mass, occasionally it went into Eastern Mass or Vermont. sometimes as far as Rhode Island. And people would send these postcards in from all over. But because, of course, what balloons do to things that live in the ocean, they stopped doing that once they realized that aspect of what they were doing. But we learned a lot from those little balloon releases. Citizen science, which is one of the cool things about a lot of things that you guys can do. You can learn and educate and find all kinds of ways of presenting information like this. Cancer rates are higher near all nuclear power plants throughout the world than they are in the rest of the population of whatever country that nuclear plant is in. In countries that have had nuclear plants and shut them down, after a while the cancer rates go down. There's a clear link. There have been dozens, possibly 100 different studies, all the different universities and government studies worldwide about the connection between cancer and nuclear power. Radiation causes cancer. That is something that they'll admit, but then they'll say, well, but not for nuclear power plants. And if this piece of paper was your shield against alpha particles, well, where do the alpha particles go? They lodge in that. So eventually, this thing will be saturated, and it'll start giving off those alpha particles. So when they bury nuclear waste in barrels, eventually, the barrels become radioactive themselves. And then eventually the soil they're buried in becomes radioactive. So every 10 or 15 years, they dig up the barrels, they take the soil, put those into new barrels, ship them somewhere, bring in new soil, and bury the waste into new barrels. That's how bad this radiation is. It stays radioactive for a long, long time. And there are small radiation, radioactive waste dumps all over the U.S., and there's a couple big ones, like in West Valley, New York. There's been talk about making a huge one in Nevada, and that's not working because there's no way to keep this safe for the thousands and thousands of years it needs to be safe. It's going to get into the water. Everything gets into the water. And anything that's coming out of the nuclear waste barrels, that'll get into the water too. The Center for Disease Control has maps of where cancer spots are. And 2/3 of all breast cancer cases are within 15 miles of nuclear power plants. It's funny, I've been doing this talk for such a long time, and it still bothers me to talk about all these facts all at one time. When 9/11 happened, the politicians of Westchester County, which is where Indian Point is located, it's about 25 miles north of the border of the Bronx and Yonkers. The politicians there, who just rubber stamped every evacuation plan that Con Ed would submit, looked at the evacuation plans that they had rubber stamped. Because suddenly they're realizing that one of the planes that hit the World Trade Center went over Indian Point. The Hudson River is a wonderful navigation tool for whether you're a bird or an airplane pilot. And so birds and airplane pilots all use the Hudson River to navigate, including one of the terrorist pilots. Went right over. Muhammad Atta, he actually suggested flying planes into nuclear power plants. He mentioned 2 plants by name, San Onofre in California and Indian Point in New York. Didn't we get lucky? So the politicians looked at the evacuation plans. Now the law states you must have an evacuation plan if you operate a nuclear power plant. It does not state that you have to have a workable evacuation plan. So they don't have one. And in the 80s, I actually got to see a map that they had for the evacuation plan. And they took a map of Westchester, and they did what looked like a Sharpie to me, and they just took a ruler, and they just drew a line, and that was the evacuation plan zone. You're supposed to travel along that line. The fact that it went through people's homes and property and woods and whatever, and not on the road at all, didn't matter. That was their evacuation plan. Go like this. Line across Westchester County. So now the politicians of Westchester worried about a terrorist attack. Now it's not just an accident, the plant, now it's a terrorist attack. Looked at the evacuation plans, and all of a sudden, all these pro-nuclear people who are taking money from Con Ed and then from Entergy are suddenly going, wait a minute, we don't like this. And the people of Westchester are suddenly in huge numbers, not the large numbers that we used to have, opposing Indian Point. And it was very hard for a politician to get elected if they did not come out against Indian Point. And you have people in elections trying to say, I'm more anti-Indian Point than you are. And as a long-time activist, I'm going, well, this is different. I'd like to see that happen in New York City. So now they're looking at the evacuation plans, find out they don't work. Governor Pataki hired a really pro-nuclear guy who had been with FEMA to work out, to analyze these evacuation plans, and he found that they weren't workable. That's the Witt report. They keep trying to stilt these things in every way they can, and it never works. I talked to the head of security at Indian Point a few years ago, who was fired for trying to do his job. The man's an ex-Marine, he looks like an ex-Marine, he talks and walks like an ex-Marine. It was interesting chatting with him. We got along quite well. And he pointed out that with a team of 2, with the security force of Indian Point, knowing he was coming, he was able to get to the reactor 75% of the time. Clearwater had a press conference on boats. They're good at doing things on boats, right? So they had a press conference with reporters on boats outside Indian Point on the Hudson River. So they're tootling around out there, right? A bunch of reporters on different boats, and they're talking about the dangers of Indian Point and all these things. And after 15 minutes, a launch comes out from Indian Point to say, you can't be here. So Andy Mealy, who was the executive director of Clearwater at the time, was like, what would you have done if we were terrorists? You know, he explained that we're talking about Indian Point, these are reporters from all these different papers, and what would you have done if we were terrorists? Ah, we would handle it. We would immediately have called in for directions. So I guess they're assuming that any terrorists who would come in from the water would be very, very polite and wait for them to do their jobs. I mentioned to the head of security, it's a hobby I used to have, and it turned out it's a hobby he currently has, so I have something in common with an ex-Marine security guard. And I said, now, isn't that a vulnerability of Indian Point? He goes, oh yeah, I told NCG about it, and they told me to shut up because it's too expensive to fix. And I'm not going to say what it is because it's too easy. One thing I will mention that's almost as bad, the Westchester County Airport is about a 6-minute flight from Indian Point. Westchester County Airport has a lot of private jets. We don't know who owns the private jets. I hope the airport does. And I hope they're able to pay attention to who's flying these things. Because if a nut decides to grab one of those private jets from the Westchester County Airport, who is going to stop them? How are they going to stop them? 6-minute flight. And they've already done studies that a very, very light plane, they took a very light fighter plane and they just let it fall onto a model of a reactor vessel, and it penetrated into it several inches. So if you took a heavy plane and you went, instead of dropping it, you dove into it, you would penetrate the reactor vessel. And you can do that with 6 minutes. So we're talking about a very dangerous situation. And the radioactive waste that is stored on site at Indian Point has less protection than that. It's basically a tin roof on top of it. So it's very vulnerable to that. Since Fukushima and since the earthquake in Virginia, a lot of people are wondering about the earthquake. They built Indian Point 1,000 yards from an active earthquake fault. It's not like the San Andreas fault that has the earthquakes that they have or what Japan has, but it does have earthquakes. It's very active. Some of you may remember having been woken up by earthquakes that happened there because we felt it in New York City. When they built Indian Point, geologists from the Mont Doherty Lab, which is one of the major geologic labs of the world, it's connected to Columbia University, they said, there's an earthquake fault 1,000 yards from where you're putting this. Don't put it there. And Con Edison said, no, there isn't. And how they could presume to say that they knew more about where earthquake faults were than the people of the Mont Doherty Geologic Lab it's incredible arrogance. But that's where they put it. I think part of the problem was in '62, when they first started building Indian Point, was when they had been defeated in Queens. They wanted to build a nuclear reactor in Queens, where the Ravenswood plant is now along the East River. You can see it from the 59th Street Bridge. That plant was supposed to be a nuclear plant. And people of Queens were like, you're not putting a nuclear plant in our neighborhood. So they moved it up to Westchester. And I have a feeling, I can't prove this, that they're told where they can't put it once. They ain't going to be told where they can't put it twice. And so they just took a blind eye to what Lamont Doherty said, and they put it there. It was only a year or two ago that Lamont Doherty discovered there was another fault that crossed the one that's 1,000 yards away. Also active. They didn't know it went exactly where. They're still mapping these things. Because there's a lot more people who study the tectonic plates where they meet, because those earthquakes are a lot bigger. They do a lot more damage, so there's more money to study them. There's a lot less money to study what they call intra-plate faults. So they discovered that one very recently. The NRC even said that Indian Point is one of the most vulnerable to an earthquake of any nuclear power plant in the country. Does that mean they're going to shut it down? No, they insist that they want to not only keep it open, but relicense it for another 20 years, past its design lifespan. It was designed to last 40 years. The 40 years is going to be up. For Indian Point 1 was already shut down for not having an emergency core cooling system. Indian Point 3, it's up. Indian Point 2, it's up next year. Indian Point 3, 2 years after that. And Entergy wants to relicense it. It makes a lot of money. So they want it. Their corporate headquarters are in Louisiana. What do they care about what happens to the people near their plant? So they want to keep it open. People in Westchester, there's a growing movement in New York City, want to close it down. Even Governor Cuomo is talking about shutting it down. Some weird kind of conditions he seems to be putting on this. I'll get to in a little while. But it was the people of Vermont that are closing down Vermont Yankee. It was the people of Long Island that shut down Shoreham in the early 80s. When the people lead, the leaders follow. And they'll follow all the time. They have to know it's in their best interest to do what you want. So you have to speak with a big enough voice. How big is a big enough voice? Well, we never know. We never know the answer to any of these. How much is enough? It doesn't take every single person in Brooklyn to get the politicians of Brooklyn to pay attention to Indian Point. It just takes enough people in Brooklyn. We don't know what enough is. Some of them are paying attention, some of them are not. And let me talk a little bit about Entergy's ads. They have these wonderful ads about how wonderful Indian Point is. And they talk about how there are inspectors on site. They've reduced the number of inspectors on site, the NRC. It's like, you don't need that many inspectors. And I guess they don't, because they have 100 exemptions for health and safety. So would they need people to examine health and safety aspects? There are pipes that carry radioactive water underneath the ground, and nobody knows where they are. Because we've asked Entergy, where are these pipes? And they don't know. They actually don't know where they are. There was a 5.8, let me read another little thing here. Plate tectonics was only a hypothesis when Indian Point was being planned, early 60s. And we now have a better picture of the patchwork of faults called the Ramapo seismic zone, which spans from eastern Pennsylvania to the Hudson Valley. A 2008 report by Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory shows that large quakes of magnitude 5 have happened in the past, and that larger quakes should no longer be considered impossible or even unlikely. The magnitude 5.8 quake in Virginia hit in the vicinity of the North Anna nuclear plant with twice the amount of ground movement the structure was designed for, cracking the wall of the reactor's containment unit and shifting 100-ton concrete casks of nuclear waste. It was the first time an operating U.S. nuclear plant experienced a tremor that exceeded its design parameters. They want to reopen this plant, cracks and all. According to Lynn Sykes, an author of the report, Indian Point was designed to withstand a quake of 5.3 at a distance of 35 miles. I find that to be such a bizarre wording. 5.3 at a distance of 35 miles. Well, what if it's the fault that's 1,000 yards away? That's a whole lot less than 35 miles. So if all it can withstand is 5.3 at 35 miles away, then how much can it withstand if it's a really close earthquake? I'm not even talking about it. We now know it sits on a previously unidentified intersection of active seismic zones. A 7 on a fault a few miles away would involve dozens of times more force than the reactors could theoretically handle. Lamont already said that we get a Richter 7 earthquake in this area about every 100 years. The last one was 130 years ago. These kinds of breaks have happened before, and they often lead to fire. Talk a little bit about fire in a little while. The callous disregard for the threats of a nuclear plant to the health and safety of the people living near it, and even how they define what living near it is very arrogant. It's very unsafe. That is why there's so much money involved that it's very easy for a politician to look the other way. And that is why it's very, very important for citizen action to happen here. Right. No emissions, they say. Right? Entergy's ads say that nuclear power plants don't have emissions of greenhouse gases. They're playing with words here because those radioactive releases that come out every day, right? They're not greenhouse gases per se, but they create greenhouse gases. And the act of mining uranium, of milling uranium, of turning it into fuel, of transporting it, there's greenhouse gases involved in every step of the way. The greenhouse gases they create, those routine emissions of radiation, ionize the air. Now most of the atmosphere is nitrogen and oxygen. You have, you have 2 atoms of nitrogen in a nitrogen molecule, 2 atoms of oxygen in an oxygen molecule. They're very stable. So it takes energy to break them apart. Well, guess what? The radiation from the plant supplies that energy. So as this radioactive gas travels through the air, it is breaking apart molecules of oxygen and nitrogen. And then they start combining with each other. And they create various oxides of nitrogen. Those oxides of nitrogen, some of them are greenhouse gases up to 200 times more powerful than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. Nitrous oxide, depending on the scientists you're reading and the energy of the molecule itself, can be anywhere from 40 to 200 times worse, molecule for molecule, than carbon dioxide. And those molecules are created every day from a nuclear power plant by the routine releases of radiation. So besides causing cancer, it's also greenhouse gases. When they make the fuel, they take the rock that they've mined and they've milled. They have these huge mountains of milled tailings out west. Just the worst nuclear accident the United States ever had was in July of '79, when a dam burst and washed a couple miles of milled tailings down the Rio Puerco River, killing a lot of Navajo and their sheep and their cattle. And I guess since they were Navajo, they didn't count because it didn't make much news. Native Americans, some Native Americans talk about it, some will not. A friend of mine, who's a Navajo from New Mexico, the Rio Puerco goes right through her town, didn't know about it. Now she wasn't born at the time this happened. So next time she went home, she started asking people, you know, there was an accident, you know, radiation, you know, what's going on? And people started crying and wouldn't tell her about it. Because people lost everything, you know, if they're dairy farmers or if they're sheep ranchers, they lost everything, and people died. People got cancer and died later from that. It took a while for her to find somebody who was willing to tell her about it, just to confirm that it actually happened. So when you have an oral tradition and things are too horrible to talk about, you lose a lot of information that's very important. Because in order to not repeat history, you know, the cliche, those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. Well, the negative parts of history are the parts of history we don't want to repeat, right? So there should be the ones we want to learn about, right? But learning about the negative parts of history is very uncomfortable. So people would rather not learn about it. And therefore, they don't know history, and therefore they do repeat it. And I'm sure that you can think of a lot of different examples of that in all different parts of history, whatever aspects of life you are interested in or involved in. And so anyway, they take this milled uranium and they turn it into gas. Because uranium-238 is the most common isotope. I don't know if I should write it down. That's the most common isotope. Uranium comes in a lot of different forms. The 238 is basically an addition of the number of protons and the number of neutrons in the nucleus of a uranium atom. So what they want is the uranium-235 and 34 and 33 because that works better as nuclear fuel. So they want to take the uranium-238 out. So they turn it into a gas and they put it through a centrifuge to separate something 3 neutrons bigger in size from the rest of it. That takes a lot of technology, and it takes a lot of energy. Not to mention the energy to turn rock into gas, especially something as heavy as uranium. So that's what they do. They take this uranium, 235 is the most common of those 3, and that's what's nuclear fuel. And by the way, that same nuclear fuel is also the same fuel that nuclear bombs use. They make it a little more pure to use for a bomb. That's why they can't blow up like a bomb does. That's supposed to make you feel better that it can't blow up like a bomb does. Now, the leftover uranium-238, what do they do with that? That's radioactive waste. It's a lot of radioactive waste. This stuff is heavy. It's a lot of it. All those bombs, all those nuclear plants, what do they do with it? They make it into munitions. You may have heard of something called depleted uranium, right? What depleted uranium is uranium depleted of these isotopes. And uranium is very, very heavy, very, very dense. They used to make armor-piercing bullets out of a titanium steel alloy. This stuff works better. It gets further into the tank that you're shooting it at. And the way they protect the soldiers who use this is they send out a memo that says, don't pick up shell casings for souvenirs. That's it. That's the protection. A friend of mine who works at an arsenal actually sent me an email of this that they send out periodically. Don't pick up shell casings because soldiers like to pick up. This is a shell casing not used in this war or that battle, whatever. Don't do that. I met a soldier who was involved in these armor-piercing weapons. She had there was 8 people in her crew. She was the only one left alive. She already had a double mastectomy. She was dying. She didn't know how many months she had left. And she wanted to tell her story. Now, it's a volunteer army. And whatever aspect of this woman's personality made her join up was still there. She was just as proud a soldier as she ever was. She was very angry at the government for not protecting her. She's angry at the government for not letting her get private health care because nobody will touch her. When they realize that it has to do with depleted uranium, that she's radioactive, that the government health care that veterans are supposed to get won't cover her, they don't want to touch it. They're scared to death of some sort of punishment happening to them as physicians for taking care of somebody who the government doesn't want to take care of. So she's another national sacrifice. And yet still a proud soldier. It was fascinating to listen to her. And people are saying, isn't there anything else they could use? That's as good? It's better than titanium steel. And I said, well, osmium is denser, but it's brittle. Can't they use osmium something else? And she's like, what? What's osmium? And you know, I don't know what she did, because I don't know enough chemistry to know how osmium works. I know a little bit more about how this garbage works. But that's the secret of depleted uranium. It's radioactive ammunition. Now, I mentioned that no insurance company will insure a nuclear power plant. In the flyer for this event, if you saw this zipping around, there's a sentence, no bank will finance them, so they force ratepayers to. And let me take that out of soundbite mode and give you a little more detail, all right? I got this by energy consultant Lindsay Auden, who's been active in energy issues for longer than I have. In fact, was sort of one of my mentors when I was a young activist in my 20s. Banks loan money to utilities and are paid back by them. But really, the ratepayers must back such loans and the interest on them. Banks would not finance nukes without existing federal insurance. So I really should explain it as no bank will finance them without help, without government help, without the rules and regulations that force ratepayers to pay this. It's not the type of financing that you would get for your house. It's a little more like the financing your teenager would get to buy a car that you co-sign. So if the teenager doesn't pay his car payments, you pay them. So when the utilities don't pay their financing, taxpayers step in. We don't know we've stepped in to pay it, but we step in and we pay for it. When they were building the Shoreham nuclear power plant, there were billions of dollars of cost overruns. Billions. The money that they spent on Shoreham, they could have put solar panels on every single home on Long Island and saved twice as much money, given 3 times as much jobs, 5 times as much local jobs, saved an immense amount of oil, which nuclear plants make electricity, so they actually save coal. And then the cost overruns kept building up. So the Long Island Lighting Company kept asking for rate increases to pay for the cost overruns, to pay for the interest, to pay for the loans. And at one point, LILCO had the highest electricity rates in the country, solely due to nuclear power plants. In fact, when Con Ed found out that they no longer had the highest electricity rates in the country, they went to the Public Service Commission and said, we want to raise our rates. It's like a competition to see who's worse for the people in their district. And by the way, the same thing happened with the Limerick nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania. PECO had to raise their rates so much that they were actually vulnerable to Enron. Enron almost took over the electricity of Pennsylvania, and they would have done the same thing to Pennsylvania they did to California. And the reason PECO was vulnerable to Enron doing that is because of the cost of the nuclear power plant that they did. They are very arrogant, going, we don't have to pay for this. We'll just raise our rates, and they'll always let us. And they always do. Or to quote Lindsay again, the ratepayer is always on the hook for whatever the banks and utility cook up together, and the PSC lets them get away with it. It does every time. When the people lead, the leaders follow, that's something we have to keep an eye out. When Entergy has the little ads about how wonderful Indian Point is for the economics of the people in the Con Ed rate-paying area, and when they say how much your rates will go up if you shut down the plant, so I have a real simple question. If Indian Point is so good for our rates, why do we almost always have among the highest rates in the entire country? And we've had 2 nuclear power plants for 40 years. Clearly, 40 years of nuclear power has not lowered our rates. It has made them get higher. That's what nuclear power does. They're making a lot of money. Their profit is our expense. That's basic capitalism. Somebody's making money, somebody's losing money. My feeling is the millions of people who are losing the money should not be the ones at the disadvantage here. Politicians should not be looking at the handful of people in a company in Louisiana making money, they should be looking at us, who are paying the money, who would then have more discretionary income to do other things with that same amount of money. That's basic economics also. So when they say they'll raise the rates, it's because it's a threat that works. When they say that, people go, oh, now electricity rates are not based on supply, they're based on demand. Electricity rates are highest in the summer when there's more demand. They're not highest in the winter. It's a demand-driven rate. It's always been a demand-driven rate. And I'll get to replacement power very soon. See, I'm running out of time and I want to get to that and take your phone calls. I'll take your phone calls, right. I'm used to saying that, sorry. Okay, how much power does Indian Point supply to Con Edison? Okay, if you look at this small print in the 2010 Con Edison Annual Report, the last one, page 119, under Electricity Purchase Agreements, you will see that Con Ed's purchase agreement with Entergy and Indian Point has already dropped from 850 megawatts to 350. So it was never 2,000 megawatts in the first place. It was 850, now it's 350. Now you can get historical energy usage from the New York ISO. So I'm going to write down New York ISO. And what you will find, New York City is Zone J, zones H and I are Westchester. Those are Con Ed territories. Before this past summer, the highest coincident peak of all of Con Ed was a little over 13 gigawatts, 13,000 megawatts. That was in August 2006. The July 23rd New York Times reported that the peak energy use on July 22nd, that was that Friday when we had 3 100-degree days in a row, and that was the third of those 100-degree days. The peak usage was briefly 13,200 megawatts, with the highest hour between 3 and 4 p.m. that Friday, when it averaged 13,189 megawatts. Now this was after calling for demand responses of about 400 megawatts between 1 and 6 Thursday and Friday, where they asked people to cut their energy usage down voluntarily, and they would, well, volunteer, and they were paid for the energy they weren't using to keep the grid safer. So 350 megawatts divided by 13,200 megawatts comes to 0.0265. So how much does Indian Point supply to the Con Edison area during peak times? 2.65%. Now they say in their ads 25%. They're leaving out two important words, up and to. On a warm winter night, when about the only electricity being used is refrigerators, then maybe they can get to 25% of electricity usage. So when you have the most other power available is when they give the biggest percentage. It's basic math also. Is there replacement power? Of course there's replacement power. There has to be replacement power. One, you need a lot of extra power in case something goes wrong with any part of the grid and any big power plant disaster. There has to be extra by law. Law also says that 80% of the capacity of our peak usage has to be available in New York City to supply New York City needs. 80% of the capacity. Some people say 80% of the electricity used comes from New York City. That's not necessarily true. Every time Indian Point has an accident, it's not supplying electricity. Lights are still on. It has a lot of accidents. Whenever it goes down for refueling, it's down for several days. Lights are still on. Remember I said how several thousand degrees is the temperature at Indian Point operates at, all nuclear plants operate at. You have to cool it down to basically room temperature before you can refuel it. When there's an accident, when there's a blackout, whatever, you have to wait for the plant to come down from the several thousand degrees to room temperature before you can work on it. All right, you're not going to send a worker to work on something that's several thousand degrees hot. It's got to cool down. That's why in Fukushima you had pouring water all the time. Yeah, the radiation's coming out and they're pouring water. They have to keep it cool, or otherwise nobody can work on it at all. You can't touch the damn thing. at several thousand degrees. You have to cool it down. So they have to wait to cool it down. That's why after the big blackout of 2002, was it 2002? August 14th, Indian Point was down for days after that blackout. It was hot, August, really hot. We had our electricity, people put their air conditioners back on, everything was fine. My point as an environmentalist is not, we don't have replacement power, let's make some. My point is, let's make cleaner replacement power. The replacement power they use tends to be natural gas in this area. There's some hydroelectric coming from upstate. There's other sources, but that's the main source. Let's have something cleaner than natural gas. Natural gas contributes to global warming, contributes to climate change, contributes to massive flooding. Let's replace that with cleaner energy. I have here, written here, Richard Perez in solar. Richard Perez is a solar researcher for SUNY Albany. And he has got a couple wonderful websites on how much solar energy potential there is in New York State. He talks about how much there is worldwide, but he specifically goes after New York State. And he's got these graphs of all the different sources of energy we have. You know, coal and oil and gas and nuclear and biomass and solar and wind and geothermal. And he has balls representing each energy source in the right size compared to how much you get from the other, compared to the other sources. And he takes the fossil fuels, all of what is known to be available, and then 1 year worth of renewable energy, because it's renewable. You get it every year. Right? Just because the sun shines on your solar power doesn't mean, on your solar cell, doesn't mean you can't use it after the sun shines on it. Every day the sun shines on it, you're still getting power. Nothing gets used up, it's renewable. And the balls are, when it does a slideshow, they're about this big for the fossil fuels, and for wind and biomass, and this big for solar. That's how much energy falls from the sun. I have seen now from several sources, there's enough energy falls on the Earth in 30 minutes to supply all the energy needs of the whole Earth for a year. I want to think about it another way. When they do a movie premiere and they have those spotlights shining, right? They can shine an itty-bitty little piece of the sky, and it takes an enormous amount of power to light up a little tiny piece of the sky. And the sun does that every single day for free, clouds or not. That's how much power the sun gives. I was at a New York Academy of Sciences talk when they had an anti-solar guy giving a slideshow about solar energy. And he got the same figures Richard Perez did. And he clearly prepared these slides in advance, so he knew what the numbers were. And he was still in shock with how much energy we can get from the sun. Because his whole part of this lecture was to show that solar energy is not feasible. And all he could find was how incredibly feasible it is. And in New York City, it's more feasible yet, because our peak energy usage is when it's hottest, when all the air conditioners are being used, and when everybody's at work with all those air conditioners. In the suburbs, peak energy usage is going to be more when people come home from work. In New York City, it tends to be in the afternoon. When the sun shines brightest is when you have the most energy from the sun to use, to power those air conditioners. CUNY has done a solar map where they have mapped every single building in all 5 boroughs. And you can go to the solar map, do a search for solar map. If you get too many things, do CUNY and solar map. And you can find your home, and you can find how much roof you have available for solar energy. Anywhere in the 5 boroughs. And it'll even, takes into account chimneys that cast shadows and things like that. Now the solar installers I know say it hasn't seemed to make their business any better. But it certainly has a lot of people got a lot more interested in solar. And also to show, there's something called negawatts, which used to be part of the energy footprint in New York State and no longer is because the utilities don't like it. Negawatts are simply not using power. and you don't have to supply power that's not being used. And so the less power people use. And there's conservation and efficiency, two different things. Conservation would be you turn off the light when you're not in the room. Efficiency would be having better light bulbs in the first place. And Energy Star is more efficient, you use less power. And I forgot to bring one of my favorite visual aids for saving energy, which is a power strip. So you all know what power strip is, surge protector. Even if it's not a surge protector, but only a power strip. A lot of appliances use power even when they're off. Anywhere from 10 to 90% is when they're on. How does a TV know that you pointed a remote at it? Because there's a part that gets on, and it knows you pointed a remote. Where's the power for those displays? You know, the little blinking 000s, blinking 12 o'clocks. There's power going to them. Now, the people who make these appliances are not paying your electric bill, so they don't care whether it takes as much energy to power the display as it does to power the appliance when it's on. It's not in their interest, so they don't make things that way. And so that's why it's called phantom load. Nowadays they're calling it vampire load, or vampire electricity, because it's electricity that you're paying for that you're not even using. And a friend of mine in Queens was complaining about an electric bill, and I kept saying, put your stuff on a power strip, and when you go to sleep, when you go to work, turn the power strip off. Instead of having to unplug every appliance, you know, you unplug them all at once. Oh, but my roommate has a VCR and he tapes things. So they put that in the wall and then put everything else on the power strip. You know, so she finally did, right? And so it's like, well, and so finally, she's like, I'm saving $50 a month. 50 bucks a month. And I said, you know I'm going on the air with this, right? And then somebody at BAI is complaining about his electric bill. Now he's got electronics out the wazoo, I mean, more than my friend in Queens. And her electric bill went from $200 to $150 a month, which seems to be pretty severe as we pay. This guy was paying $300 a month for all his computers and his, you know, equipment and everything else. And when he finally started putting, because he complained, my power strips are behind my desk. I said, then put them in front of the desk. Put them next to the desk. I mean, you know, don't complain about your electricity bill if you're not doing something about it. So he finally did. And his electric bill went from $300 to $200. He's saving $100 a month. Simply by putting his stuff in a power strip. And that's why I like to bring it as a visual aid, and I'm mad at myself for not bringing it just because, you know, people remember it. The other thing I'll mention before we take your phone call, I mean your questions, is, maybe I should go into another room. The solar energy industry follows the public policy. Whatever rules and regulations are in place to make the industry work better or work worse. Those of you who are old enough to remember when there weren't that many movies, TV shows, and commercials filmed in New York, and suddenly there were, because the city made the permitting process for that industry smoother. They call one number, and they get all of the permits taken care of. So you get your Department of Transportation, your buildings, and you know whatever else. Everything's taken care of with one phone call. And thousands of people are now employed in the film industry because of all the commercials and TV shows and movies that are made here. Because it's easy for them to do that. On Long Island, in Suffolk and Nassau, if you call a solar installer, I want solar panels in my house, and you know, he comes and tells you how much it's going to be for your particular house and your situation and how your roof is. In 1 or 2 months, those panels will be on your roof, giving you free electricity. In New York City, it takes a year to a year and a half. Because on Long Island, the solar installer calls one number and gets everything taken care of. And it's one inspector for everything taken care of. In New York City, it's a multitude of inspectors, it's a multitude of numbers, you have to make lots of calls, it adds up to a lot of time,
It adds up to a lot of money, what they call soft costs. It's not the cost of putting the solar panels up, not the cost of the panels themselves, or where the inverter is connected to the grid. It's all these other costs. And New York City can do the same thing for the solar industry that they did for the film industry. There just has to be political will. In fact, streamlined permitting is on Plan YC 2030 that Bloomberg mentioned years ago that he's done absolutely nothing with. Again, all talk and no action. When the people lead, the leaders follow. Today, there was a hearing for the City Council that Jim Gennaro, City Councilman from Queens, head of the Environmental Committee, about streamlining solar. Well, guess what he wants to streamline it? He wants to streamline it for the big out-of-state solar companies, not for the people who've been doing solar power for years and years and know the city and know how everything works. Because these big solar companies did a fundraiser for him, a $500 a plate dinner and all this kind of stuff. And he's letting them write the legislation. So instead of having feed-in tariff like all the other solar installers in New York want, they want solar renewable energy credits and they want it to work a certain way. And so that hearing took place today. And I was getting ready for this, I couldn't go, and I asked a bunch of solar installers, anybody going to this, anybody taking notes? And that's what I found out, that it's a smokescreen, basically. You know, when money gets involved, and the whole 1%, 99% that the Occupy Wall Street people have gotten everybody so conscious about, when they get involved, they can turn anything benign into something awful. And they seem to be good at it. It seems to be like their life's work. Let's make something good into something bad. And let's find another way of doing it. And they do this all the time. Tighten your home so it uses as little power as possible so that you get the smallest and cheapest solar array possible for your needs. And I'm thinking, you know what? Environmentally, it doesn't matter whether you use less electricity and power in a different way, first or second, as long as both things are done. So I'm no longer telling people tighten their home, because everybody who wants solar panels, that's what they want. They want solar panels. And the making their home more efficient always comes later. But since it always does come, me as an environmentalist, I go, okay, fine, get your solar panels first. And if we ever get the feed-in tariff law that Vermont has, like every country in the world has, which is why they've grown their solar industry so much, which is why Germany, in December 2009 for the first time, their entire grid was powered by renewable energy. And it has happened several times since. Again, it's, energy usage fluctuates depending on the weather and what people are doing during the day. So their goal is to be 100% renewable electricity by 2030. I've been doing Ecologic for almost 10 years, and it was about a year in that I learned about their goal of 2030. I think they were ahead of schedule. And every time I talk to somebody from Germany or who goes to Germany, who studies solar in Germany, are they still ahead of schedule? And they are. They have been ahead of schedule for 10 years now. There's been many moments in time when their entire grid was powered by the sun and the wind and the tides. And we're further south than Germany is. The United States has more potential to do that than Germany does. But Germany has political will. They put their money into making sure that all the people of Germany start buying solar panels and put it on their homes. So everybody is like power plant. Energy independence. The United States public policy is to invade other countries to take their oil. And the amount of money we spend to invade another country to take their oil, every home in America could be made to use half the energy it uses and still have millions of dollars left over. And the number of jobs that would have given if every home in America is being fixed to use less electricity would be tremendous. And there goes our deficit and everything else. So now I'll take your listener phone calls.